Great. Okay. Well, this is a big welcome to Noel Brock, who's very kindly, well, he's taken over everything for us in a way. He's absolutely brilliant because he's joined our committee. He's very active, but that's not what I want to say about him. I've got some little things to say about him, and I find them. Yeah, here we are. So Noel's company has for many years been building, planting, and maintaining private and commercial gardens in and around Hampstead, central London. During this time, he's also pursued his interest in wildlife worldwide and within the London area. There is an obvious connection between wildlife and horticulture, but only in the last 3 years has he been able to bring those worlds fully together. So we're looking forward very much to your talk, Noel, on urban garden wildlife, changes in popular culture and professional practice, which will give us plenty of food for thought on what we do in our own gardens and on the Heath itself. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, so my name is Noel, as Liz said, and I've lived near Hampstead Heath most of my life, spanning the 1960s up to the 2020s. From the 1960s to the 2010s, the decline in wildlife abundance has been quite rapid, but the decline in diversity was less rapid thanks to isolated relic populations of once common but now rare species hanging on in the untidy spots and forgotten corners, often in private gardens. Anyone in the nature game must be pleased with the recent boost in public nature awareness, but how well is this wave of good intention being directed towards connectivity between the bigger reserves of wildness, like Hampstead Heath, and the relic untidy spots and the newly created wild places which are planned or in the process of being created? Now, Jeff, who you all know, and the Hampstead Heath Survey Committee are working with Camden Council to create a corridor from the southeast corner of the Heath, Parliament Hill area, into Gospel Oak, through Kentish Town, places like Murphy's Yard and the City Farm, down to St Pancras Gardens and into the city. This is an ambitious project, and I've offered to build the ponds that we required in these places. An important factor regarding terrestrial and aquatic reptiles and amphibians is the question of how truly connected these ponds and woodlands will be, isolated as they will be from one another by roads. Recently, I was shown by our own Joe Maddox from our committee a wonderful wildlife conduit which can be cut in and retrofitted across roads. Absolutely wonderful invention, this. I've no idea what this cost. It doesn't look that cheap, but it looks well within the scope of a city council to accommodate these things. I've got experience of building very successful and indestructible wildlife ponds and other habitats on local nature reserves and other sites in Camden and the surrounding boroughs. But without those conduits, for many species, the ponds, though good and resilient to human disturbance, will remain largely isolated from one another. And the movement of plants and animals between them would be limited to those with an airborne lifestyle, for example, odonata, and without good, biodiverse, nature-friendly private gardens forming corridors between the actual reserves. We populate our wildlife gardens with our own curated collection of wild plants, native and officially naturalized. For example, the Lysimachia punctata I mentioned earlier, which is a southern European species, to please the clients who are paying the bills after all and demand a long flowering season from February to November, and also to serve the animal inhabitants as well. This is an officially designated nature garden in one of the sites we look after, which is a school in Frognall, Hampstead. This is quite a shady site, but with sunny patches, as you can see. We've got a wood cranesbill growing in the shadier areas over on the right side there, and a Centranthus, oh, actually it's a white flowering Centranthus ruber right in the center of the picture where the sun strikes in, sort of dappled shade area. very successful wildlife area, this one. It's been there for about 5 years now. Moving on, yeah, this is a much sunnier site at the other end of the same site, actually. They about 500 meters away, further down Frognall, which is a completely open site, full sun, and we're able to use plants like this is Gladiolus illyricus, native plant, but very, very rare in the wild now in Britain. Presumably it was at one time more common. I believe there's a small colony still in the New Forest. Well, we plant them all over the place because, as I say, they're native and they do really well. Once they're established, they absolutely shrug off any problems and compete very well with ruderal weeds. You can see there's a dock there growing up alongside the gladiolus right there in this picture. Much smaller sites we managed to shoehorn a wildflower collection into. Again, here you can see you've got actual native wildflowers like the purple toad flax there right in the very sort of center left of the picture. And what else have we got there? Oh, here is the very Lysimachia punctata, the dotted loosestrife I was talking about earlier. Show the yellow flowers there, well done. And with naturalized, gone wild, non-native species like this Lycnus coronaria in the center of the picture. There's a white version of it there, a white cultivar, and the natural sort of rose pink cultivar as well. And these we blend together into a beautiful sort of quotes wildflower display, which really pleases the clients and lasts for many, many months of the year, but is also very welcoming to all the wildlife species that we want to be using it. And just to the right of this slide, you can see an example of a little sign that we put up in areas where we find it unavoidable to have an untidy looking period in the sort of annual life cycle of these wildlife gardens, which sometimes simply can't be avoided. And obviously we want them to be there to accommodate the wildlife, but to sort of bat aside the criticism of visitors. And for example, in this particular example, this is a school, and the parents would criticize the site for looking just like a mass of weeds. So we simply put up a sign explaining why it has to look untidy at that for that winter period. Okay, moving on. Yeah, here this is a so-called wildflower meadow at one of our sites. We're required to cut this meadow at the end of every year because of a ceremony that's held there for Remembrance Sunday. Adrian Brooker, I'm sure you all know, the Hampstead Heath ecologist, suggested rotational cutting so that we didn't actually have to clear cut it in October every year. And I think that's an excellent idea. I'm negotiating the possibility of doing that with the headmaster of the particular school that this meadow belongs to. Because of the problems around establishing a good, diverse plant and animal community in our wildlife ponds, it's vital, once the community has managed to get established, that the pond is totally protected from being destroyed. Ponds lined with a waterproof liner, usually PVC or butyl rubber, are extremely vulnerable to destruction by the liner being punctured deliberately or accidentally and the water draining away. I'm sure we've all seen those sad empty ponds on nature reserves and parks where all the hard work and good intention have been wasted because a vandal with a sharp stick punctured the liner and all the water drained away. When we build a wildlife pond that's intended to be permanent and indestructible, after we install the underlay, then the waterproof liner, we cover that liner with another layer of underlay and then lay onto that complete covering of broken reclaimed paving slabs, which are very easily found at any rubbish recycling site. Then we use bricks or concrete blocks to create a troughed shelf around 2 or 3 sides. Then we spread a thin screed of fine concrete mix over the whole surface, completely covering the slabs, push the screed in between, in the gaps between the slabs, and use it also to secure the shelf that I just mentioned. If anyone's interested in how we do this, I won't bore you with the details now, but I can send you a complete protocol of all the stages of actually how to do this, to create this indestructible wildlife pond. After a couple of weeks, the screed will have gone off nicely, even in winter. So now you fill the pond with tap water and leave it for 10 days. Because 90% of the concrete volume is made up of reclaimed slabs, the liner is fully protected by thick concrete, but the volume of actual fresh cement is only about 10% of the total volume of concrete that we used. Just a couple of bags of cement and a bit of sand. After the water's been standing for 10 days, you can see the blue color coming out into the water to the right of the slide here. That's the plasticizer and all the cement chemical coming out into the water. And after 10 days, it's pretty much all come out. Pump out the water and repeat the process twice. So it's thoroughly rinsed and then it can be immediately used. So you have your indestructible pond with a developing plant and animal community. I always start off a new pond with a bucket of animals taken from one of the established local ponds that we look after. We look after wildlife ponds all over Hampstead, West Hampstead, and the surrounding boroughs. So we've always got access to plenty of pond animals. Here you can see I've accidentally managed to dip out a couple of tadpoles there. Shouldn't have done that. We normally concentrate on the invertebrates in our ponds. I always start off with a mixture of Acellus aquaticus, example, which everybody knows. This is a water hog louse, fantastically useful animal. Once you've introduced 2 or 3 of those, they breed like crazy. And as you probably all know, they eat fallen leaves, any organic matter that's lying in the bottom of the pond. They chew it up and stop it from rotting and causing problems in the pond. Also, we will introduce animals which are abundant in all of the ponds we look after, like Gammarus pulex, the freshwater shrimps, and Daphnia, cyclops, and other planktonic crustaceans. Snails, which we always have loads, flatworms, leeches, all the other little pond animals which can't easily find their way to a new pond without our help. Mayflies, damselflies, dragonflies, mosquitoes, etc. will arrive on their own, usually very quickly. In this slide, you can see we've got damselfly larva on the left. That's a common blue damselfly larva. And on the right, that's the larva of a pond olive mayfly. And this particular one was in a pond that a new wildlife pond that we had built only 6 weeks before, literally just 6 weeks before this animal appeared. We had first broken ground to build this pond. And so 6 weeks later, they're already fairly sort of half grown. It's a pond olive, that particular mayfly. So the parents of this creature must have been laying eggs within 2, at the most 3 weeks of the pond being filled with water. So it was absolutely delightful for us. And there were hundreds in there. What else have we got here? Oh yes, here we are. This is the pond that I showed you a few slides ago, being lined and covered in the broken paving slabs. This is the same pond. That building was going on in January. This is the pond in April, with a few plants added and the water animals. You can see there how crystal clear the water is in the pond already, because all the little freshwater plankton are eating the floating algae, and it's all getting established really nicely. And we've got another slide here showing the same pond again in July, completely established. And already we had 4 Odonata species living and breeding in this pond in the second half of its first year. But puncture and loss of water are not the only threat to a wildlife pond. In a public access site, visiting teenage boys are a relentless threat, dragging out plants, catching newts, frogs, etc. in the spring. One planning measure that helps is to site the pond with only one accessible side. Here, for example, it's the same pond again, but you'll see from a different angle, you'll see it's sited so that one side is tight up against a wall, so people can't get to that side, and the other side is obstructed by an old, what we already found on the site, a sort of bug hotel of pallets. We rapidly replaced that ugly thing with a pile of sticks and logs, and let the shrubs grow rankly on that side, so that basically the pond only has two sides for access, and the wildlife has somewhere across the pond inaccessible to escape to. Another very helpful device, if you have a pond which is already in existence and sited in an open site where you can't choose an inaccessible side, or inaccessible more than one side, is to fell a tree into the pond. Here we have this is one of our wildlife ponds at Westby Copse, you may know, in West Hampstead. A local nature reserve, very successful one, where we built one of our indestructible concrete protected ponds. And there was a constant problem there with teenage boys dragging out the plants from the ponds and generally make nuisance of themselves at every weekend. So we, after a bit of thought, we felled some small trees, there was some excess ash trees standing around we didn't need, and there was I think there was a robinia as well that nobody wanted there. So we felled these trees, laid them with their twiggy branchy ends literally into the pond, and it really helps if the tree is big enough not to be dragged out by the same interfering boys. So in this particular one at Westby Copse, we used 3 small saplings which could have been moved. So we bolted them all together. We laid them in such a way that the stems could be bolted together to form one big immovable lump that so far, 3 years on, nobody has actually managed to drag out. Great. Here you can see that they've allowed the plants protected by all this twiggy and branching material. The emergent plants are all protected in the center, can't be dragged out anymore, and they're grown up through all of these branches, which if you look closely, you can see all the fallen tree and all of those branches is still there, but you can't even see it because all the, that's of course a chorus, what is it, yellow flag growing up through them. And we've solved the problem there of the vandalism in this particular pond. A good spin-off, a useful spin-off of the dead wood method is the creation of ideal egg-laying sites for Odonata satchers, southern hawk and dragonflies. And here is one laying an egg on a bit of dead wood lying on the edge of one of our ponds. Obviously, a natural bottom pond, made by damming a stream, for example, is preferable. But if you must use a liner, that's how to do it. Another species needing connectivity via gardens is hedgehogs. Here is one. That's actually in a project that we're working quite closely with in, not on Hampstead Heath, but in Hampstead Garden suburb, joining the Heath, to have a really thriving hedgehog population. This one obligingly turned up while Joe Maddox was visiting my friends at this project and getting to know each other. And as I understand it, the 2 adjoining hedgehog projects are now cooperating with one another. And this one just turned up literally while they were first meeting. That's a good omen, certainly. Creating corridors for hedgehogs from inside the heath into surrounding gardens and green spaces has been impeded not only by roads, but by fences. I've made some progress there. My company, amongst other things, looks after the Hampstead and St John's Wood Eruv. This is a religious boundary surrounding Jewish neighborhoods. And most of the length of it is composed of private garden walls and fences. The continuing line of connecting private fences has to be repaired and to remain unbroken, which is our function. However, only the top of these boundaries has to remain unbroken to fulfill its religious function. So I've been able to persuade the surveyor in charge of the North London Arabs to allow my company, and if they can do it, Heath Hands as well, the Hampstead Heath Wildlife Volunteers, I'm sure you know, to install hedgehog passes under these boundary fences wherever we already have access, and put me in touch with private owners so that I can persuade them too. And here is one being installed in a point at the edge of Branch Hill, right near Judge's Meadow, where the heath, sort of the open land of the heath, breaks into fenced private gardens. So we've got a hedgehog pass fitted into there. What else am I doing? Yeah, I'm also doing a series of shows and talks like this one, really, to the landscape industry as a whole, to persuade them that by that sort of nature-aware lateral thinking, other commercial gardeners can take actions themselves as individuals and as companies to benefit wildlife in many ways and avoid harming wildlife accidentally by making small but mindful changes in the way they work, how they interact with their clients, and how they install all of the multitude of landscaping products that are not intended to harm wildlife, that can do a great deal of harm if installed without the right information. This example is a tree irrigation pipe. Whenever any urban landscape or anybody plants a tree these days, they always put a section of this perforated pipe, which is about 3 to 4 inches diameter, the length of that pipe leading from the above ground down into under the roots of the tree, to make it easier to water it during the establishment period over the subsequent several years. Now, this particular length of pipe had been cut off almost flush with ground level, presumably in an effort to for tidiness. And so the result was that I found this appalling result, where we have here yes, here we are. Adrian Brooker thought this was a black clock beetle, but whatever they are, they all appear to be more or less the same species, and hundreds of them had fallen into this pipe because it had been cut off at ground level, making a very effective pitfall trap. And they'd all fallen in and died in the bottom of the pipe, and they were flushed out by the gardener coming in a dry spell to water the tree, and they all floated up and flooded out over the side of the pipe. And nobody even knew that this beetle massacre was going on until I pointed this out to them. So this is just a minor detail of installation of a common, ordinary piece of landscaping equipment, which could have been done in a slightly different way and avoided all of these deaths. I'll be doing a panel discussion at the Landscape Industry Expo Futurescape in London next year, to show the audience of professionals some examples of how the installation of everyday landscaping products like this can lay quite unintentional but very effective and lethal traps for garden wildlife, and to show them how these traps can be avoided. I'd like everybody's help here, because I'm sure that you will all have seen some occurrence like this in a garden, where some erstwhile harmless bit of equipment has been installed in such a way that it's murdering the wildlife. Show me these examples and I can talk about them and do my whatever I can to avoid this sort of accident happening in the future. You should be able to see bottom right of the slide here, where you can send me the pictures and the description of what was going wrong. Okay, so going briefly back to ponds. Another important aspect of the training is showing garden maintenance managers and landscapers all the alternative means they can employ to avoid adding chemicals to garden ponds. If you've looked around a garden centre, as I have, you will see dozens of products available to fix the problem of, there are 3 problems. There are dozens of products aimed at blanket weed, the filamentous algae, duckweed, the little tiny actually they're flowering plants, aren't they, which float on the surface of the water, and so-called green water, which is a microscopic single-celled algae which are suspended in the water column and make the water green. Now, we've got a solution to all of these things, but I get loads of communications from within the landscape industry asking me for solutions to the problems created by people adding these chemicals, none of which, of course, work. Here's a slide illustrating the best way to remove excess duckweed without accidentally removing aquatic animals, or the more desirable plants like frogbit and other floating plants. Here's a very effective method of removing blanket weed, no chemicals involved at all. You see, just wind it onto a stick, a bit like candy floss in an old fun fair. All of these things are very, very simple and quick to do, but you have to be shown how to do it. And the green water caused by single-celled algae can be controlled simply by introducing live Daphnia pulex to the pond in the early spring. These animals, there we are, there's Daphnia. These animals then graze on the algal cells and clean the water in a few days, then keep it clean forever. Live Daphnia are available cheaply by mail order, cost about £2 a packet. And they arrive in a little bubble pack with a bit of oxygen, and they're usually alive when they arrive and ready to start work. The cultures you buy usually contain other species, such as cyclops. So you quickly establish your own little freshwater plankton in your pond. Each of these three very common garden pond so-called problems have a huge range of garden chemical products aimed at it and marketed as a cure for it, but none of them are of any use at all except to make money for the manufacturers. And many are very harmful to a freshwater ecosystem. People frequently contact me through the landscape associations asking how they can fix a dead pond which has been assaulted with a succession of destructive chemicals. I always advise them to remove all the water, rinse thoroughly, and start again using our methods. Never use chemicals again of any sort. Doesn't matter what they are, none of them work. With our training material and other activities, I spend a lot of time trying to persuade landscape and horticultural professionals to love creepy crawlies. But there's no doubt that birds and, of course, furry, cuddly mammals are a much easier route into people's hearts. Hedgehogs are one of the environmental PR keystone species, and in my promotion of the aforementioned hedgehog highways, I've always had universal support and approval from all concerned. As the scheme rolls out, I hope that we can continue that. The cooperation of private garden owners and the gardeners that work in them will be crucial. It's early days after all, but most people I talked to seemed supportive, and I recently managed to put Jo and her colleagues in touch with Britain's biggest living garden in Hampstead Garden suburb, joining the Heath. This project has the potential to be a template for how housing and wildlife can grow together in harmony. It's a really, really great project, and we're doing a lot of work with them. Another cuddly furry mammal that's making headlines in the world of conservation and urban rewilding is the European beaver, Castor fiber. And because of beaver's inevitable connection to water, I can combine my love of freshwater habitats with work on beavers. And I've already taken a delegation of 19 landscape industry leaders on an outing to the beaver reintroduction site at Paradise Fields in Wembley. And a follow-up visit is planned. Not many private gardens would accommodate a beaver family, of course. And as the law stands, beavers can only be released in the UK into a fenced enclosure with expensive dig-proof fencing. There it is on the left of the screen there. It has to have a big area extending onto the ground as well. And double gates for access. However, it's inevitable that some of these resourceful and powerful animals will soon escape the confines of the several fenced rewilding schemes which are already in the London area and start turning up in the Thames and its tributaries. So, what outcomes can we expect from this gradual expansion of the wild beaver population? Firstly, the press will have a field day, as they have with white-tailed eagles. Horror stories of beavers undermining canal banks and seawalls, beaver attacks on innocent and peaceful dogs, which will soon be found to have attacked the beavers in the first place, Even beavers depleting fish stocks. I've heard that one, I'm sure. But for the actual effects of a thriving wild beaver population on an urban river system, there are plenty of existing living examples in Europe to use as a template to predict what might happen. I travelled recently to Poznan, large Polish city standing on the banks of the Warta River, which, joining the Odra, flows north across the North European plain into the Baltic. The Warta is tamed in that, like the Thames, it's not straightened as such, but it's been prevented from flooding onto its traditional floodplain by embankments. Here is, you can see an embankment running on the left of the slide there, and the river and a little reduced floodplain is enclosed to the right of the bank. With these banks in places, some of its cut off meanders, oxbow lakes and swamps are also confined within the banks. This creates a sort of inevitable wildlife reserve through the center of the city, which is, you find that in many of the big cities on the North European plain, which is absolutely wonderful. I've seen them in Spain and many other European countries as well. Basically, all you need is a big river that needs space. Beavers are promoted by conservationists as ecosystem engineers because of the way they dam and divert small streams on the periphery of a river catchment. Here is, in fact, a beaver dam at Paradise Fields, the site I showed you a couple of slides ago, in Wembley. And the site was originally a swampy site, which was drained artificially hundreds of years ago and is still crisscrossed by ditches. Now, this new beaver family, there's immediately got down to damming the ditches. And that's the sort of size of stream that beavers typically dam. This ability, which so delights conservationists, is what alarms farmers and other anti-beaver lobby groups. What if they diverted the Thames or even the Brent or the Colne? This fear totally misunderstands the way beavers adapt their behavior to the size of the river they're living and working on. Of course, they wouldn't attempt to dam or divert the Thames or even the Brent. The dam building activities are always confined to streams of about 1 metre or less in width. If the dams are sometimes hundreds of meters long, that's because on fairly flat land, the ponded water will spread out over a wide area and will continually try to escape round the end of the dam, causing the beavers to lengthen it a bit, then a bit more, and so on. Throwing 100-metre plus dams across major rivers, the beavers are always left to men, who do it everywhere, unfortunately, causing a multitude of wildlife harms. These harms are gradually being recognised, and here's an example of a dam that's recently been removed on a major river in Arizona, in the United States. And the floodplain, the ruined floodplain, you can see in the background there is gradually, or actually probably rapidly, going to recover to its former glory. You can see in these pictures, we're back to the Warta River now, how a thriving beaver population lives along the banks of this large urban river, using the water to safely travel and largely unseen, and building their lodges into the bank of the river near to stands of tasty poplar or willow trees, you can see in the center of the picture there on the far bank, that they've coppiced for their convenience to create a tasty supply of edible small twigs and branches. If there was any danger of them digging into flood embankments, the city authorities would drive them away very quickly, you can be sure. The beavers live happily in the swampy woodland and the oxbow lakes which lie along the course of the main river. Fully wild beavers in the Thames Valley would behave in just the same way. Indeed, of all the previously native large mammals which can be considered for reintroduction into the UK, I think beavers would present the smallest number of risks or problems. There would be space for one family at least in Buckingham Palace Gardens. Maybe we should have a word with the King. And that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. No, that was absolutely brilliant. What a lovely, lovely ending. So,
That was Dindy's ending.
yeah, well, the king probably would be quite happy to have.
Well, he should get down to it. Yeah.
Yeah. My understanding about the beavers in particular is that when they're sort of coppicing because when they've cut a tree down like that, like you showed in your last couple of slides, new shoots will spring up which they can then eat. Is
That's right.
that correct?
Absolutely. And that's why I suspect that plants like hazel and willow and several of the poplar species like aspens, which are really good for coppicing and respond really well to that sort of treatment, I suspect they evolved alongside beavers for precisely that reason.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask, or has anything come up in the chat that I think Jeff was keeping an eye on for me?
It's Jeff here. I've got a question for
Hi, Jeff.
Noel. Hi. And I didn't, there's nothing's come up in the chat specifically on the talk, but my question is, I remember back in the 70s, the campaign to eradicate nutria from
Yes.
Britain. And I had the pleasure this summer of being in France, where I found enormous populations of nutria. And the fact that it had been eradicated here was done because of this worry about erosion of waterways and banks and things like that.
Precisely.
But I now am thinking on reflection, maybe this was a little bit exaggerated. I don't really know. They're considered one of the most invasive mammal species in France. Of course, they don't build dams. They may not have the same ecology. I'm just sort of interested in that comparison. And maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I witnessed nutria when they were common in East Anglia, because even as a kid, I was going out to that part of the world bird watching. And I remember many people listening will know Cley Nature Reserve on the North Norfolk coast. It was a mecca for bird watchers when I was a kid, still is. And there was always a big colony of nutria at Cley. You could watch them. In fact, I watched them far more avidly than the birds, often from the hides. They've had a big area in the middle of the reed bed there that they'd sort of cleared, and they would behaving very much like the way you see capybaras in wildlife movies from northern South America. Big group of them, 20 or 30 adults with a lot of babies, living quite happily in the center of Cley Reserve, as far as I could tell, not really having any bad effect on anybody or anything. However, in East Anglia, it's there's a very particular sort of regime because of all the drained fenland there. The rivers crossing the fenland are in many cases 10, 15 meters above the actual water level in the rivers is 10 or 15 meters above the surrounding farmland. And they're enclosed within really very narrow banks. They look exactly like, and in fact, they are really just canals within big earth banks, but with no space to spread outside those banks, not like the Warta River I was illustrating in Poland. And so I suppose it might have been, not that I ever heard of any actual case of this happening, but I suppose it was a potential, a theoretical danger that nutria in one of those rivers could have burrowed through only, say, 25, 30 meters of bank, reached the outside and created a hole for the water to run out. I guess they could physically possibly have done that and from the normal everyday 365 days a year river level, rather than just a sort of a flood barrier, which is what the banks on the Warta River are, which is maybe why nutria were persecuted in Britain far more than they have been in Europe. They're common. Yeah, I've seen them in many places in Europe, and muskrats as well, which are sort of smaller version and behave in similar way. Nutria are very good to eat, by the way, because of course being unprotected, an invasive species, there's no prohibition killing and eating them, and they're popular to eat in Poland. I've eaten them and they're absolutely delicious. Yeah, so that's the story of nutria. I think that's why they were killed off in Britain, because of the danger of these canalized East Anglian rivers. And I think they also could potentially live in perfect harmony with other animals in most parts of the country. And beavers also are their habits are rather different. I mean, nutrias do burrow, and they actually create burrowed dens and breed in those dens, whereas beavers create they build a lodge. So everybody knows how beavers live. So beavers don't have that burrowing activity that nutria do. So I'm sure that you're absolutely right. That will be one of the many objections raised to releasing beavers into the wild, but I think it can probably fairly easily be knocked down as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
There was a question about how much of a problem to dogs pose to beavers in the wild. I don't know if you know much about
well that was raised on the landscape industry trip which I did to Paradise Fields, which was hosted by the excellent Elliot Newton. Now, he's the biodiversity guy of Ealing Council, and he's in charge of that, an overall charge of that project. And somebody asked him exactly that question, and his answer was that beavers, wild natural beaver populations, have always had to cope with wolves around them, and they've evolved alongside wolves, and obviously are consider wolves their major enemy, and have learned ways of dealing with them, and are not afraid in as much as they will flee an area because wolves are there, but they've just learned ways of dealing with them, which is one of the reasons that they have these offshore lodges to live in. That's what that is in large part, he believes, an anti-wolf measure. And if dogs or a pack of dogs was threatening a beaver family, the adults would face them off. They're pretty powerful animals with big sharp teeth, and would get the babies off into the water and hold the dogs off until they had a chance to flee themselves. And obviously constant dog activity and constant dog interference would not be good, but an occasional dog attack, I believe, I think he's right. I think beavers could cope with it pretty well.
What about ponds? The ponds you've been making drying up. Do you just top them up with tap water?
We've never yet had a case of them drying up, because obviously they're unpuncturable, and so they retain the water they've got. For example, the one at Westbere Copse down in West Hampstead that I showed you a picture of, the one that we felled the tree into, that is about 70 centimeters deep in the center. And when we first built it, because it's hundreds of meters from a water supply, we actually got the local fire brigade, the Blue Watch fire brigade from West Hampstead Fire Station along to fill it up for us the first time, much to the delight of my younger daughter, who was a little kid then, about 6 or 7, and she was allowed to hold the hose filling it up. Got some pictures somewhere of that. And it's never needed filling up again. Now, during that drought summer, was it 2 summers ago, the water level dropped by nearly half, but now it's filled up again with rainfall. So, and that drought summer was really quite extreme, and there was still certainly plenty enough water in there to maintain the population of everything that was living there. And now it's filled again. So it's never been artificially topped up since its first filling 10 years ago.
Do you have problems with silting up in any of your ponds? The one you showed us that you built presumably was put in such a place that it wasn't going to be subject to muddy water running into it.
Sure. Well, there's one that we built in Mill Lane. It's actually called Mill Lane Pond in Mill Lane open space. Mill Lane is also in West Hampstead. It's one of the old streets of Hampstead. It's a continuation of West End Lane. And there used to be a mill there. And I believe that the pond we were working on there was the original old mill pond, but which had dried up completely. And we over deepened the spot where the pond used to be. It was a sort of ghost pond. We over deepened it, lined it with the butyl liner that I'm describing, and protected in the same way. And that also we had to fill up artificially. Initially, there was fortunately a water supply not too far away there, and that has a supply of silt running into it because it's supposed to be topped up by rainfall around the local area, and there are a couple of pipes diverting rainfall and water off roof gutters and that sort of thing into it. And I suppose ultimately it will start to fill up and need clearing up, because none of the ponds that I built are very deep, because for legal reasons you can't have it. You know, it's much you wouldn't be allowed to have public access and all that sort of thing to a small pond. So they're never more than about 70 centimeters deep at the start. Thus, all of them will need clearing out from time to time. And that's another reason why it's good to have them built in this indestructible way, because in years to come, when you've got people not knowing what the dangers are of them ponds, standing in them with boots and shovels and that sort of thing, it's good to have them indestructible for that reason as well. So they will ultimately need cleaning out and emptying by local conservation groups, probably 10 to 15 years time, I should think. Yeah.
There's a question, just some advice. We have a 2x4 rigid pond we inherited. Any recommendations for plants? And is it likely to evaporate?
2 foot by 4 foot, that's quite small, isn't it? What's that, about 60 by 120 centimeters? The smallest ponds that we usually install, we have which I can send you, anybody interested, I can send you a protocol for this as well, which is a plastic tub that we've located that you can buy, a very rigid, tough polythene tub, which is circular, of 1.2 meters, 120 centimeters diameter, 4 feet, that is, by a foot deep, 32 centimeters deep. And we find that makes a very effective little instant wildlife pond, because we can install these in about an hour anywhere that we're allowed to. And they, all that we've installed are still functioning, still full of water. None of them have been damaged or drained, and none of them have yet needed to be cleaned out. But the first one that we built, that we installed, was only about 6 years ago. The size of pond that this person is describing is half that size, 60 centimeters by 120, and that can make a very effective small wildlife pond. Whether it's going to evaporate would depend entirely on how deep it is. If it's at least 30 centimeters deep, I'd say no, never naturally going to evaporate before it's topped up by rainfall. If it's in a garden, you can always top it up artificially anyway. And regarding the plants, I would go for hornwort, easily available in ponds all over the local neighborhood, which is a submerged aquatic plant that spreads very quickly, creates a nice community in the water. Let me see what else. A yellow flag iris, always very pretty the way they flower in the spring, and they're tough and you're not going to fail with them. Everybody wants a water lily from Garden Centre, an Nymphaea, white flowered water lily, and a 2 foot by 4 foot pond is quite big enough for that. And what else? Something, the fourth thing. Oh yes, water mint is lovely. It makes a lovely cup of tea, and also very easy to grow. Water, that's another emergent plant, very pretty, very good for insects. The flower heads are very attractive to insects, like all mints. Anything else?
About the tall loosestrife.
Oh yeah, lovely. Lythrum salicaria, purple loosestrife, absolutely glorious. A bit big maybe for a 2 foot pond, but yeah, because it grows to 2 meters tall. But if it's well anchored, it won't fall over. Yeah, so that I would suggest putting that in a heavy basket. The pond might be a bit small for purple loosestrife. But if you've got a slightly more space, of course, it's absolutely lovely.
Kennedy's got his hand raised.
Hello, Noel.
Hi.
Thanks very much for a splendid discussion.
Thank you.
More of the same, really. Are we generically, LNHS really, advocating, do you think, that most small London gardens should have ponds? The person who asked the last question was a particularly small one, but not much bigger all over North London or wherever part of London you are.
Absolutely. As I say, these instant tub ponds that we install anywhere we're allowed to, we quite often put them into school grounds. They are only, I repeat, they're 120 centimeters diameter, 4 feet diameter by a foot deep, 30 centimeters deep, just a literally a round tub, like a big bucket. And we use them because they're very tough, rigid polythene, indestructible. You can't even put a pickaxe through them. And because they're circular, incredibly easy. Just put them down, mark the hole, dig a hole and drop them into the ground. They work fantastically well, and they are quite big enough for, we've got them installed around the neighborhood, and we've had, obviously they always acquire, we start them off with the small animals, the invertebrates that I described earlier, with the Selus aquaticus and Gammarus and animals like that, a bit of Daphnia. Put in a few plants, and then all of the dragonflies and damselflies and mayflies just arrive within the first couple of years by themselves, and all of them within a gratifyingly short time acquire frogs, and even one up in just in Frognall, not 500 meters from where I'm sitting now, we found a newt hibernating under a bushel. Just a few meters from it. So I expect we'll get newts in that pond as well, without them ever being artificially introduced. The animals find these places, and once they've found them, they start using them, and then they find them completely adequate. So a pond of that size will work really well. 2 foot by 4 foot, also in a small garden, can be made to work, but it requires just a little more maintenance because that's very small, and you would need to, empty it out, pull out the rubbish that falls into it probably a little more frequently. That's all. And also you'd be a little limited in the size of plants you could use.
And there's a bit of chat that Kat was suggesting about avoiding drowning.
Drowning?
Yeah, hedgehogs and things. So.
Yes. Okay. Right. Well, we always suggest that the number one, you can actually install these tub ponds even more quickly by digging the hole for them only half of the required depth. So the pond is, the tub is 30 centimeters deep, and we will dig a hole 15 centimeters deep and then use the soil that's been dug out to build up a little bank around the sides of it so that animals have access from outside. So it's like a little sort of surrounding bank around it. We would normally, with the turf or the soil that we've dug out from the central area, we would insert that into the bank so that it's already got lots of rank weeds and grasses growing in it. And these weeds and grasses very quickly hang over the edge into the pond. So you've got a double protection. Firstly, animals will have to climb up a little bank a bit to get into it, so they're not likely to just stumble. It's not a pitfall trap. That's also quite useful for people walking past. They can't so easily just drop their foot over the edge of it if it's surrounded by a small bank. And the massive rank grasses and weeds hanging over into the pond from the outside edge provide a very good purchase for any animal wanting to scrabble out. You can, of course, install an artificial ramp as well, putting a couple of rocks on one side if you want to. But I find that these plants hanging into the pond are perfectly adequate for frogs and newts to climb in and out. And though I've never witnessed this happening, I'm pretty sure that a hedgehog would manage to scrabble its way out as well, I think.
Splendid, thanks.
There's a question here about, so I have a garden, or I don't have a garden, but I have a washing up bowl in among my pots. I put in an oxygenating plant
Not seen
and
anything
got
in there.
sunshine centre. I've not seen anything yet, but yeah, do you agree?
There certainly will be microscopic life in there, yes, almost certainly. And in a situation like that, where you've got just a tub of water not even buried, it's surprising. I'm not sure how they arrive, but I've found cyclops, which is another, not exactly microscopic, but so should we say planktonic crustacean, related to Daphnia. I've seen those arrive in the most surprising places, and so I suspect that cyclops must have such tiny eggs. If you look at them under a microscope, you'll see they're carrying bags of absolutely tiny sort of pollen grain sized eggs around with them, the females, of course. And I suspect that those tiny eggs might even blow around on the wind, you know, and I've seen cyclops turn up eventually within a year or two almost everywhere. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to see cyclops in this little tub of water. And if it's remaining clean, it doesn't have the green water algae in it, I suspect that there are animals in there like that because they must be eating it, you know, to keep the water clear. That's why we introduce these planktonic animals to our ponds, because they keep the water nice and clean. If the water's clean, somebody's keeping it clean usually.
This one I read that very shallow water is good for bees, birds, etc.
It is indeed, yes. It is. It's good to have a shallow edge if you can possibly arrange it for birds. I mean, you can do that in even one of the tub ponds that I'm describing by just putting a rock or a breeze block or something on one side of it to create a little shallow area, which birds will then, because birds bathing like to stand in water 5 or 6 centimeters deep and like dip their whole body in. Yes, of course they do. So that is very useful thing to add. I mean, I remember reading not so long ago that quite often barn owls are found drowned in cattle troughs in one particular area that I was reading about, and it was suspected that because owls had those very soft, spongy feathers, that owls attempting to drink or wash were toppling into cattle troughs from the edge, because they of course have they're just a tank with a narrow edge and immediately deep water, and that these owls were all falling accidentally in and drowning themselves. So I mean, in a situation like that, if you had a shallow area at each end created by anything, just a block of stone in the water, that you could avoid that sort of problem. Yeah.
I think Jeff wants to say or ask something, and I think probably we better think after that of finishing this off. So Jeff,
Okay.
over to you.
Okay, I'll be quick, but Noel, your talk gave me a bit of a revelation about nature corridors, because one of the problems we've had in trying to create nature corridors through Camden using public spaces is that you can often get the resources to set up plant a hedgerow, put in a pond or something like that. But because it's a public space, it's not owned by anybody, and it requires volunteers. And often, particularly with the weather we have these days with droughts and rainstorms, those green spaces can easily disappear. They can dry out as ponds and so on. But if they're private gardens, if they're actually own somebody's property that they're maintaining, there's a much greater chance of that management. And the big problem with putting corridors through public spaces is the maintenance need. You're not going to get Camden or a local town to do the job for you all the time, or they might not do it well. It's too specialized. And of course, getting volunteers is hard. So I realize that maybe it is, private gardens are a backbone to building corridors, not just because it's a lot of the green, but because it's a lot of the green that people actually have a commitment to maintain.
They curate it, they look after it, and they keep out vandals, dogs, and all that sort of undesirable visitor. Absolutely, absolutely. And I believe, I mean, I make the point as often as I can in these talks I give to the garden industry, because it gives them a sort of feeling of importance as well, to point out to them that private garden ponds are really one of the last safe reservoirs of aquatic invertebrates, you know, with the problems with dog swimming and the chemicals coming, you know, all the stuff that we're talking about. Private garden ponds are likely to be an absolutely vital reservoir of these species, which other water bodies can be recolonized from when all the chemical problems have been solved in the future.
Well, lot of food for thought, and those of us that have gardens are going to be thinking about how we can turn them into green corridors, and those of us who rely on public spaces hopefully will look at this in a bit more detail to how we can volunteer to keep our own particular patch of green space good for wildlife. Noel, thank you so much. That was really excellent, and I think we had a good discussion there afterwards. And you've left your email there on one of the slides. So
yep.
If anybody wants to contact you and didn't pick that up, if you can either go through the recording again once it gets put online, or else email me, and that's Hampstead Chair at lnhs.org.uk, and I'll give you Noel's email address. So thank you very much indeed, and look forward to seeing everybody at our next AGM in a year's time, with, I hope, plenty more exciting new things to tell you about, and another excellent talk to back it up. So I'll say goodbye to everybody now, and do feel free
Thanks, Liz.